Hi, this is Lionsart Productions and welcome to this tutorial. In this video I'm going to explain how I mixed and mastered this track. This is an epic/orchestral music track. So this track was made by Epikus, so I'm going to put his channel link in the description of the video below. Now I'm going to play just 1 minute of the track so you have some context for the rest of the video. Alright, so let's talk about strings. First, panning, yeah. Well, when you use a library, it generally comes pre-panned, so you have violins on the left and basses on the right, naturally. But sometimes I like to accentuate that effect to make it more wide, more dramatic. So that's exactly what I'm doing here. As you can see, while I'm pointing at my screen, that's dumb. You can see I'm putting the basses more on the right and the violins more on the left. So just making everything a bit more wide. But be careful with that. If you do it too much, it's gonna sound weird. Okay. Then I'm routing all my strings to a bus. I'm not doing much to the individual channels on the strings, but everything is going through a bus. Then just a bit of compression, not too much. As you can see, at the beginning there is almost no compression. It's barely moving, but in the end, between 2 and 3 dB. So that's just to make the strings a bit fatter and to add a bit of color to the strings because this is a vintage compressor. So of course fast release, always use the fast release if you're going to compress stuff like that. Because there is dynamics, there is spiccatos, there is movement, you don't want to crush that with a slow release. Then you have EQ. So with strings, the main problem I found was there is too much mid-range between 300 to 700, and that builds up, and you actually need that space in the frequency spectrum for brass and choirs and stuff. So it's a good idea to cut strings around here. So here I'm taking out around 2.5 dB, yeah, I think 2 dB at 350, and I'm also cutting more mids, like 1.5 dB from 200 to 700, as you can see here. So that's just to control a bit the mid-range. You can see that if I have too much mid-range, it sounds like that. And that's exactly what you want to avoid. So now strings, it's a good idea to add a bit of high end because it helps them poke through the mix. So I'm adding from 11 kilohertz, I'm adding 3 dB, and then I'm adding even more with this second EQ. So overall maybe 4 dB around here. So quite a bit more high end to help the strings be more sharp. It's not a bad idea. And also I'm cutting bass. The reason is that the lowest harmonic of the contrabass is not that important, and it could muddy up all the drums and all the stuff you have under 100 Hz. So I would always recommend to cut here, because most of the bass from the contrabass, you will hear it around 100 and above. So yeah. But as you can see, it's a good idea to use automation, because at the parts where there is no percussion, like this part, I'm actually automating the EQ here, as you can see, to allow the lowest harmonic to poke through. So I don't wanna cut it if it's not needed. I mean, there is no drums at this moment, so why not? Let's keep it. And that's pretty much all for the strings. Alright, let's move on to the brass. About brass, well, it's going to be quick because it's pretty much like strings in my opinion. Generally, brass have mid-range, low mid-range build-ups, which you want to get rid of. So if we take French horns, for example, I have a bunch of French horns layered, but I won't go into detail with that. Overall, I'm just cutting mid-range because of that harmonic. That sound is naturally needed and it can, well, it's needed, it's important, but it can quickly muddy up a mix and it's very loud. So you might want to make the brass a bit sharper and a bit less roomy and boomy around this area. That's pretty much it. And of course, don't forget to filter out the low frequencies, which you don't need. I have done it in the other EQs, which are on different layers, but I won't go into that. The general rule for brass, I would say, is watch out for that. So yeah. So it's pretty much the same for all kinds of brass, like trombones, trumpets, and tuba, for example. But sometimes the boominess I talked about can happen at different ranges. Like the tuba might have this boominess around here. You might have to cut at different areas, so don't cut exactly at this place. Depends. But yeah, a bit more high-end to make it sharper in the mix, if needed, depend on the library. Sometimes you don't need it. But yeah, watch out for these fundamental harmonics. So I guess that's pretty much it for brass. Now I'm gonna move on to percussion. When it comes to drums, it would take hours to really explain how to mix drums, so I want to keep this video short, but I'm gonna try to explain. Basically, you have different types of drums, and you want to choose which drum is gonna do what in a mix. These drums are really low, and they have lots of sub-frequencies, so they are actually doing this sub-area of the mix. That's where they sit really the most. And I'm cutting lots of mids, because that's generally not needed with big drums. You can hear how it sounds if you leave some of that mid-range. It's just washy and it's blurry and boxy. I don't know how you want to call it. It's bad. So I have these drums which are my lowest drums, as I said. And just above that, I have other types of drums. I have taikos. These taikos are slightly higher drums. So in that case, they won't have as much sub bass. So I'm actually making sure that I'm cutting all the sub. I mean, by sub, I mean 50, 60, 70. I mean, all the stuff pretty much below 80, 90 hertz. And that's just leaving room for the big war drums. So now there is room and both can fit together really nicely. And you need to do that pretty much for every type of drum. But you can't have too many. I mean, that's pretty much the maximum. I would say 2 big drums, big ensemble drums. That's pretty much a maximum. You don't want too many types of low drums. Alright, then I have these really big hits happening. As you can see, these big hits have a lot of sub. Obviously, I know what you're gonna say. It's gonna interfere with the war drums and taikos. So I can't have all this sub at once. It's too much. It's gonna sound blurry, muddy, and not good overall. So what I'm doing is that I routed these 2 main drums which I showed you before. I'm routing them through a submix, and this submix has a multiband compressor on it. And whenever these big hits happen, it's compressing all of the sub bass of the main drum mix, so all the war drums plus taikos. So basically I'm making room for the new sub bass which is coming from these new drums. So that way it works. If I don't do that, it's just gonna build up and it's gonna sound bad. So that's how you keep some definition in the drum mix to make everything better with lots of drums. But I mean, honestly, these were not really needed. But they sound cool, so I just kept them. You have to find tricks to make everything fit together. You can't just layer tons of sub. Now, I also have higher drums, which like cymbals. Well, it's not really a drum, it's a cymbal, but Now cymbals, what you wanna look out for is hard treble. I mean treble around 6K, 7K. This treble can be really annoying and ear piercing. Alright, not gonna make you suffer. So sometimes some samples, there is too much. You need to cut it. On this sample, it's fine. And I'm actually even adding a bit more treble from pretty much 10K to 20K. I'm adding a bit because treble from 10 to 20K is actually less aggressive than treble from, let's say, 5 to 10K. So you might want to boost a bit here if you want more shine or sparkle to the mix without making you cringe with treble, if you know what I mean. So with cymbals and metallic instruments, you also want to look out for low frequencies because you don't really need them, but you also need some of that mid-range. And yeah, you don't want to cut too much because this is what happens if you get rid of the mid-range on a cymbal. Yeah, it doesn't sound like a cymbal anymore. So filter out what you don't need, maybe around 200, 250, you know, but it was already pre-mixed on this sample, so it's fine. But make sure you don't have too much. It's fine if there is a bit, it's not gonna ruin your mix in any way. You can leave it if it's a bit. All right. Then I can't go over every single type of drum and stuff that's going on here, but I can give you general tips for mixing drums. So I would say the first thing is your big drums, you can actually do parallel compression. Parallel compression is blending some of the original signal and the compressed signal together at the same time. So basically it's a good way to compress drums without killing the transients and killing the impact and dynamics. Then I would tell you it's a good idea to apply some distortion to big drums because distortion makes stuff a bit more crunchy, a bit more epic, but be careful. If you add too much distortion, it's gonna sound like a mess, but a bit of distortion can help drums be more defined and more aggressive. Then that's pretty much it. Yeah, there is more stuff here, but that's I think I'm gonna stop now for drums, and I'm gonna move on to the vocals/choir part. Right, now choirs and vocals. Now choirs, it's a bit like strings. You also have that mid-range build up. As you can see here, if I didn't cut here at around 800, it would be a bit mid-rangey and weird. It sounds bad around this area most of the time. So in a lot of choirs, you need to cut here a bit. You also sometimes need to cut around 200 to 300 because you have too much. But in this choir, it was fine. This choir sample was fine. But on some choirs, it's gonna sound like that. And that's a bit too muddy because it's not really needed. That's not what you're gonna hear in the mix. This is just filling up the frequency spectrum, I mean. I also have some high frequency boost to add definition to the choir and sparkle. I have the same EQ going on for the staccatos, and I actually have a DSR. This is optional, but if your choir goes like sa and you have too much s, you can actually put that down a bit with a DSR. Then I have a female vocal. That was originally a mono signal. Oh, the reverb was off. Okay, that was a mono signal, but I actually kind of turned it to a stereo signal. Well, not really, but I kind of chorused it using a delay. As you can see, this delay is a 1/64th ping pong delay. And what it's doing is that it's kind of phasing the vocal a bit, and it's creating some chorus effect. So that makes the mono vocal sound a bit more stereo. As you can see here. So this is a cool trick. It can help make things a bit wider. And then I have some EQ. I'm cutting around 1K. Because of that mid build up that I noticed on this vocal as well. And then I'm boosting around 16K because I want more shine and sparkle top end. And that way it sounds good. And to finish, I have the Epikus vocal. This is actually the composer's voice. Now, I put the same delay trick at the other vocal, just to make it a bit wider. But I actually had to use compressors on this vocal, because it's a live vocal. It's not from a library, so the vocal was not compressed, so I need to do some compression. This vocal has two compressors. One faster compressor, which takes care of the loudest peaks. I'm compressing around 2 dB, and one slower compressor, which is compressing a bit more. And that's just pulling down, that's just evening out the vocals in a really smooth way. And then I'm having some EQ. I'm pulling down some of the entering mid-range. Cutting all the mud, which is not needed. The first harmonic of the vocal is around 400 here, you can see it. That's the first harmonic. There is no sounds here, just noise. So cut it. And then I'm boosting around the treble area, just to add more shine and definition and bite to the sound. Now, when it comes to reverb, try to imagine yourself as the conductor of the orchestra. So what's in front of you? Strings. So don't put too much reverb on the strings because they're quite close to you. But brass and choirs are really further back, so then you can put more reverb on them. Now, when it comes to making a realistic reverb sound, try not to have reverb times longer than 2.3 seconds, because it might sound good on a single vocal or a single instrument, but once you put that reverb on everything, it's gonna sound really muddy. So for a realistic whole, I would recommend from 1.7 to 2.3 seconds max. Now, the pre-delay is quite important. It's basically allowing some of the raw signal, non-reverb signal, to go through before the reverb kicks in. And that's actually realistic because when someone plays an instrument in a room, you hear some of the early reflections, the non-reverbed one first, then you have the reverb, which kicks in. So for a realistic whole, I would recommend from 20 to 35 milliseconds. That's a pretty good setting. It really depends on the size you are looking for. Now there is more settings, but generally a whole reverb has a cutoff. There is not too much high frequencies. So you generally want to have a cutoff around 5K, but it's not like a super aggressive cutoff. As you can see on the graph here, you have to roll off some of the high frequencies. About volume automation, it's quite important when mixing because sometimes bad things happen. For example, this female vocal got completely drowned in the mix at this rising part. But now you can actually hear it because I pulled it up like 10 dB. And for example, these individual hits, I had to nudge them down individually because they were too loud. But the volume of the drums was good for the rest of the track, but just these hits were too loud. So don't be scared to do some automation. You might have to do 3 tracks of automation, 7 tracks of automation, 15 tracks of automation. Well, if you need to, do them. Well, if you do your dynamics correctly, you don't have to automate the volume of everything. But yeah. When it comes to mastering this style of music, I would put the effects that are going to affect the sound the most first. So stereo enhancers and stereo imagers can change the frequency content of the track quite a lot. So I use them first. Then I'm going to put some compressors. I have 3 compressors doing a bit of compression. I like using several compressors because it's more transparent than using just one compressor. So overall, for mastering compressors, I would say use low ratios, 2, 3, but you don't want to use high ratios. You don't want to crush the track. I would say slow attack and fast release. The slow attack is because you don't want to crush every transient, every hit of the track for mastering. You just want to compress it smoothly. So a slow attack and fast release. Fast release is because you want the track to keep going. You don't want to crush the track for a long time every time you have a huge hit, for example. And then I have my EQ. The reason I have my EQ last after all these effects is because, yeah, all these effects are going to affect the frequency content and the spectrum of the track. And you actually want to make the final corrective EQ last. In my opinion, that's how it should be done, because that's going to be the final tonality, tonal balance of the track. So just put it after all the effects which can actually change that tonal balance. That's how I would do it. So if the mix is good, you don't need to do crazy EQ. On this track, I just pulled out a bit more mid-range, but as you can see, it's like minus 0.6 dB, minus 0.4 dB here. It's not crazy. I don't need to do much EQ because the mix was good. I'm just cutting the very low bass, which you can't really hear, so from 30 Hz and below. Yeah, here on this first EQ, before my stereo imager, I actually added a bit of high frequencies, but it's mid-side EQ and I'm not going to go over that. So yeah, do the final EQ of your track just before the limiter, that's what I would recommend. Then I have my limiter. So my limiter, I like a fast limiter because I feel like it works really well for most of the music I mix. So for this limiter, I'm having a ceiling at minus 0.3 dB, and that's quite important to get rid of intersample clipping. You can Google that. Then I'm setting my limiter threshold so that I'm having a bit of gain reduction and a good level, a good overall average level and loudness of the track, but without being able to hear the limiter. If you can hear the limiter and the bad artifacts and the bad things it's doing to the sound, that means you push it too hard. You shouldn't be able to hear the limiter doing its thing really too much, or at all actually. So on this track I was able to achieve a pretty good loudness of minus 5 dB RMS at the average level. But for some tracks you can't make them that loud, or maybe some tracks you can make them a bit more loud without really hearing the track getting destroyed. But don't focus on making your track as loud as possible. It's not that important. If you can make it loud, great, but you don't have to. So be careful with that, because you can destroy a track quickly with a limiter. Don't forget to use dithering. But that's pretty much it for mastering, guys. So thanks for watching the video, and bye!